Yep.
To the cloud.
Yep.
Yes, perfect. And good. Welcome, everybody. I am Rabbi Julie Schonfeld. I am the CEO Emeritus of the Rabbinical Assembly. And I am here today with my friend, the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, a Buddhist monk ordained by the Dalai Lama, who is the president and CEO of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT. He is the author of a recent memoir, Running Toward Mystery, The Adventure of an Unconventional Life. We are here to talk about COVID-19 today, also what the prospect of a COVID-19 vaccine will mean for society, as well as talking about the spiritual and personal lessons that can strengthen each one of us as we continue to cope with the impact of the pandemic. Venerable Tenzin, in order to begin, I would most appreciate it if you would tell us a little bit of your spiritual journey and your life story.
Certainly. Rabbi Julie, firstly, thank you for having me. It's a delight to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on the current affairs that plagues the world. Um, in terms of just my background, in a nutshell, I was born in India and decided at a very early age uh, to uh, to go on a religious path. So I became a monk when I was 10 years old, and had the good fortune of studying with some remarkable teachers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's my mentor and preceptor. And partly because of his encouragement and partly because of my own curiosity, I decided to come to the US uh, to sort of explore secular universities and to study the sciences and Western philosophy and so on. And serendipitously ended up at MIT almost 20 years ago. And now I run the Center for Ethics there. And it's been a quite a learning curve altogether.
Well, I'm very glad that we can have this conversation today, especially as it relates to matters of public health. Myself, as a rabbi, I became very passionate about the arena of public health because I feel that it is one of the ways in which society most tangibly expresses its highest values. And I also am very interested in the fact that whereas, especially in the US, we see health as something that is personal, the scientific discipline of public health sees health as something that belongs to the community as a whole. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on those issues, on what is health, what is public health, and what is this time teaching us from your perspective?
I think one of the key things is to recognize that there is no such thing as just personal well-being or personal health if we are not to think about the health of civic society or the health of the communities that we are part of. And this is a lesson that sort of I learned quite early on because as a kid I used to hang around Mother Teresa when she used to do her work uh, with the folks who were infected with leprosy, and there was no sort of public health policy around those kinds of things. And it was interesting to see how certain individuals, largely driven by sort of their religious ethos to serve, would take charge and sort of fill this big void that existed in public health issues. And I think we see similar kinds of challenges today in the U.S., despite of it having somewhat of a robust health infrastructure and so on. That there are certain aspects of public health gaps that I think needs to be filled in by leaders, social leaders of other sorts, and so on. and more importantly, to look at sort of broader questions around public health. Um, um, uh, as in our earlier conversation, I was mentioning that to look at, for example, as for lack of empathy or lack of public trust as a public health issue, that it leads to seldom when we are designing health policies or public policies do we think of the importance of empathy or promotion of trust or human trust. But what we have been witnessing in at least last 2 years in this country are some grave symptoms of lack of empathy and trust. And I think it is leading itself into a public health challenge, and we need to sort of seriously think about these things.
So that's fascinating. Could you say more about when you think about actually characterizing empathy and trust as in and of itself, what I hear you saying, a health issue, and in and of itself, a public health issue? Are there sort of specific ways that either we personally as individuals in our own spiritual practice, as people of faith, as people searching for faith, are there things that we can do to strengthen our empathy and our trust?
Certainly, certainly. So both from an individual level and at the level of communities, we can certainly exercise certain kinds of, you know, humane practices or even spiritual practices to nurture and strengthen our ability to empathize with others, and the sort of underlying conditioning that allows us to have a healthy sense of trust. You see, there's a lot of conversation about health and well-being, see, but nobody is giving you metrics on what is optimal health, what is optimal well-being. Is it simply not having certain kinds of grave illnesses? Meaning, what does a healthy individual actually look like? What does a healthy society actually look like? So we are still sort of struggling to define the metrics for what optimal well-being looks like. And in that quest for defining well-being, we need to sort of, think deeply through some of these kinds of conditionings that actually have been, not the focal point of our conversations, but are very important. You see, so a simple thing like when you take about the health of a community or health of any institution, any civic institution, like democracy, for example, you see that any institution only functions as well as there is a sense of trust to that institution in a civic society. Right? But if trust is dysfunctional, if our ability to empathize is dysfunctional, then it sort of makes those institutions more fragile. And therefore, any policy or design of policy, deployment of policy that occurs from those institutions sort of carry with it this kind of fragility that becomes then difficult for communities to accept on their part. So that's why I believe that, I mean, of course, we can go into the issue of the cost of depression to public health, personal depression, the cost of depression of certain demographics to public health. But I think there are plenty of studies that would show that many of these causes or conditioning underlying such sort of aspects of depression, loneliness, and so on has to do with issue of lack of empathy and public trust.
Hmm. So that's fascinating. And I want to come back to that in a few minutes more deeply, because obviously issues of depression, loneliness, these are, part of the illness and the suffering that many people are going through, in addition to those who become ill with COVID-19, the, very, very serious physical effects. But I want to talk for a few minutes about, COVID-19 vaccination. We are just sort of at the beginnings of seeing, this is now the beginning of January when we're having this discussion. So we're just beginning to see the vaccine roll out. And I'm wondering, does your tradition have specific guidance on vaccines, from a faith perspective?
I think the guidance is always to put the health of the community first. Um, Buddhism, the first precept of Buddhism is the principle of nonviolence. And part of the extension of the principle of nonviolence has to do with non harming, meaning that whenever you are making decisions or designing a policy, if it can help others, that's wonderful. At least it should not be something that creates harm. And when we are looking at, an arena of infectious diseases and so on, you always have to ask yourself that, if I don't partake in the process that is not only good for my personal healing, but also good for the healing of the community, then am I creating tendencies of harm? Am I sort of intentionally actually creating tendencies of harm? So that I think is an from a sort of responsibility perspective, that's something that drives our day-to-day decision making. From a personal perspective, as individuals, of course, the idea is to remain physically healthy, to be able to carry on one's spiritual practice. I mean, it's a responsibility that we owe to this physical body to maintain a sense of health and well-being. And so, any scientific advancement that occurs in terms of promoting health and well being is something that the Buddhists sort of seriously encourage, they seriously look upon since the time of Buddha himself.
Mm. That's so interesting. Could you say more about Buddha's teachings on sort of things that increase health or ways to increase health? Is there something in particular that
Sure, sure. I mean, part of, I think, the general health principles are driven by lifestyle choices. And so in the Buddhist worldview, there is, of course, this idea of, what is the lifestyle that you choose that is most conducive to your spiritual well-being? And when you're looking at spiritual well-being, it sort of automatically lends itself into physical well-being, meaning how much sleep do you get? You see, and that's again an important question to ask, because we as a generation of humans have never been as much sleep deprived ever before in the history of humankind. And we are the only species that tries to artificially regulate sleep. Nobody else does that. We humans do that, and not always for good reasons. So the first thing in Buddhism was get enough sleep, uh, and enough sleep compensated by enough meditative practices so that one can maintain a calm attitude towards all that happens in life. And it's a discipline that one sort of takes on daily. Being mindful again of what you're eating, how much you're eating, who you are eating with. That all those things sort of fundamentally tie into this aspect of personal well-being. Uh, Buddha had his own physician, Jivaka, who authored quite a few medical treatises. And you will see that as Buddhism evolved in various parts of the world, one of the things, in addition to religious texts and commentaries that were getting authored, in all cultures and all societies, there were Buddhist medical treatises that were getting authored. And there was always this kind of synergy between medical treatises and how they perceive the biological being, the biological person, how they perceive the spiritual person, and what is the correlation between the two. So it has always been a fascinating thing. Yes, it is true that much of it was focused on mental health for the longest period of time, because that's one of the fascination that the Buddhists have, which is how to, for example, you know, uh, regulate emotional states so that we are not living our lives dwelling and driven by destructive emotional states. How to maintain sort of a calm attitude, especially in the face of destruction and so on. That these were all things that sort of lent itself again to overall, well-being of an individual and therefore well-being of the community as well.
so tell me, thinking about you said something about trust and empathy, right, which are very clearly important aspects of the community's health. And also, issues of people sort of trying to take care of their own health. And what do we say? How do we advise people? One of the things that we've seen during this COVID-19 pandemic is that societies most vulnerable, of course, have been most profoundly affected. They've gotten sick in the largest numbers. They have been the most exposed to having to go to work in public places, travel by public transportation, live in crowded housing. What, as a Buddhist, as a people of faith, what do we do now that we see this, right? How might this change our society? How might this encourage us to build trust through taking actions? Who are we to each other?
I think that's a great question. I think who are we to each other is sort of the underlying force of what brings a society together or divides a society. I think one of the things that we did recognize, I hope we recognized as a society in this past year, is that there is a lack of culture of care.
Mm.
And that's why I think that in order to, that this is not just a thing that happens once in a while, that we'll begin to see that it's not just in the face of pandemic or natural calamities or certain kind of crises, where we sort of become occasional actors of compassion, you know, that we need to sort of create a culture of care and compassion. Okay? And so who we are to each other must be driven by this culture of care and compassion, and recognizing that, my liberties are in no way hindered if it is driven by a sense of care and I put on a face mask, if I put on a mask in order to sort of support the health and life of other individuals. You see, again, the intention of not harming and the intention of supporting the well-being of the larger community. So I think it fundamentally goes back again to this idea that what kind of role am I playing as an individual in creating this culture of care and compassion, which is a must for a healthy, wholesome civic society.
Hmm. How can we, what would you say if someone were to come to you and say, as a person, I want to trust and I want to help my society, I care very much, but I'm worried, right? The vaccine is new.
Mhm.
Maybe I have witnessed, things happen in the news that I feel like, this is, they're afraid, right, for their
Right.
personal health. How do we advise someone who really wants to do that, but also has this concern?
I think there are multiple parts to that. I think one is that I often tell my friends in the scientific community that they have a storytelling problem. They're good with mining data. They're good with proposing the data, but people don't change mindsets and habits just based on data. People change habits and mindsets based on narrative, on stories. And so one of the things is that the scientific community could really use some help in good storytelling that is convincing, storytelling that is sincerely sort of representing the data that the scientific community has come up with, but it presents in a way that is not harsh, that is not condescending, that is more sort of gentle in its approach, again, to promote this sense of trust towards these things. The second thing, of course, is the role of governance, and the role of governance within that, I think the role of religious leaders and faith leaders is that they need to do their homework. They need to have proper counseling, proper advisors who can give them good information on what these things are, or what these vaccines are, what's the origin of it, what are they made up of, what are these processes, and so on. Having all that, we should still recognize that there is uncertainty. Having all that, we should still recognize that there are a lot of unknown variables, just like in life. And so it's a question of making a decision or making up a choice with having some sense of comfort and confidence based on what are presented to us. Now, if there's too much noise and there's too much confusion, there's too many different kinds of stories floating around, some much more antithetical to what the scientific community is trying to propose, then I think it becomes again a responsibility of members of government and members of religious congregations and religious leadership to try to amplify the more correct voices, the more correct way of storytelling, because there is this element of trust that religious leaders or civic leaders enjoy of their constituency, of their congregation. And therefore, I think it becomes more responsible for them to be thoroughly informed by it. But again, recognize that this entire enterprise of pandemic or of life is something that teaches us to embrace uncertainty. We will not know for sure everything about this, but it always becomes an issue of what will be good for the larger chunk of population, what will be good for the most vulnerable members in the community, in the society, and you make a decision based on that.
So, as someone who has spent much of your life, right, pondering uncertainty, the uncertain nature of life itself, have there been things in this pandemic that have surprised you?
I mean, there have been both good and bad surprises, I would say. I think what surprised me the most was the mixed reviews that people were giving about the effect of pandemic. So for example, individuals um, who were who took a certain approach of solitude and took this time with family, with themselves as an opportunity, as opposed to individuals who perceived this as more of a loneliness. Again, a simple shift in mindset: loneliness versus solitude. Let's say solitude is a wonderful opportunity to reflect, to introspect, to grow, to flourish. Loneliness is quite opposite of it. It is alienating, it is torturing, and so on. And so individuals, just with the simple change in mindset, were able to sort of change the day-to-day behavior, the day-to-day activities to be able to better sort of adjust and adapt to the limits that the pandemic was imposing on us. It also gave opportunity for individuals to take a pause from the mechanical rut of life and to question deeply: is this what I want to continue to do? Is this what I want from my life? And those moments of pondering are always the most powerful moments. They're not always the most pleasant moments in life, but they're always the most powerful moments. And I think this pandemic allowed for that. And again, this aspect of uncertainty is important in the sense that you know we fear uncertainty, we deny uncertainty, uh, but the fact is all of life is uncertain, meaning that any story that we tell ourselves about certitude in our life is an illusion. You see, it's a fabrication of certain sorts. And the interesting thing about the pandemic was that it increased our aperture for embracing uncertainty because you couldn't plan. You couldn't plan for the month. You couldn't plan for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road.
Mm.
And for the first time, many were able to sort of look at what life looks like when they can't plan for sure. That they can plan things, but they have to be very agile in the ways things change. And that sort of speaks volume of human resilience, which is a wonderful quality, wonderful trait again to nurture, to cultivate as individuals or as a society. So I think people have had different sort of relationship with uncertainty, but I think for the first time, you couldn't have designed a better social experiment at such a large scale. That for the first time, we have heard of different pockets in different society that faces uncertainty in a much more stark manner. But for the first time, everybody was there. For the first time, everybody was there at that particular level where all our playbooks sort of went out the window. There were no best business practices to fall back on. There were no best sort of ways to live our life to fall back on. That we all had to sort of adapt and learn new things.
Yeah. How would you counsel people who during the pandemic are experiencing loneliness? Some people are experiencing depression. Are there specific things you spoke so eloquently about that difference between solitude and loneliness? Are there certain actions that people can take or practices that you would sort of point people towards to help their mental health actually in this time?
Certainly, certainly. I think one of the important things is to design certain rituals of well-being. And what I mean by rituals of well-being, that we all have habits and rituals. From even secular individuals have secular rituals. But even coming up with simple kind of ritual, which means that you do it daily, you do it regularly, and you do it for a certain period of time, and it doesn't matter what your mood is, you still do it. You still engage in it. And so, some of the rituals like just focusing on one's breath, to be quiet, say, uh, to take a time out from anxiety, you see, no matter how unusual it may feel, because oftentimes our sense of identity is so wrapped up in our ability to feel anxious about things. You see, to be able to say no, the world is not going to end if I suspend my anxiety for 20 minutes or for 25 minutes. You see, to be able to sort of distance oneself from that, to take up certain kinds of practices around physical well-being, like small dosage of yoga or tai chi or just a walk or a swim, to be able to sort of again do something out of the ordinary, you see, not just to process anxiety but to to suspend it. And that's the distinction, that oftentimes we undertake certain kinds of practices, spiritual or otherwise, to manage anxiety. You see, but I'm not asking you to manage anxiety. I'm asking you to distance yourself from it, just for 20 or 25 minutes a day, so that you can feel what it feels like. So you can feel what that sense of freedom is like. To connect, to find friends in a way who are not just entertaining you, friends who are not just giving you career advice and things like that, but friends with whom you can have a few deeper conversations about how you're feeling, what the priorities in life ought to be, and so on. Meaning fundamental human conversations that you can have with a few people. Um, Take on a religious or a spiritual practice if that helps, even if it means to do it online or virtually, because the community cannot get together in person. But then to recognize that these rituals that you have developed for this pandemic is something that we should continue beyond the pandemic, meaning that it should not simply be done in a crisis mode, because we humans, we all suffer from this perpetual amnesia, where when we have a moment of crisis, we may discover something wonderful, but as the crisis fades, we go back to being complacent. We go back to old habits, so that we never actually fully explore what these new rituals, what these new wholesome habits can do for us when we are not constantly under the pressure or grind of immediate crises.
Venerable Tenzin, that is, I think, incredible advice and very enduring advice. And I feel like we, in many ways, that's a good place to bring closure to our conversation. But before I do, I'm interested if is other ideas that you would like to share, other things that you feel are particularly important for people to consider in this time.
I think the only sort of suggestion or urge that I have for individuals, especially if they belong to a particular religious group or organization, or people, whether they are in leadership position or not, is that to recognize that, you know, we have been dealing with multiple layers of pandemic in this past year. It's not just COVID-19, it's the virus of tribalism, it's the virus of how we treat one another with a level of indifference, with a level of indignity, and so on. That it's time for us to seriously reflect and put into action, uh, you know, this aspect of care and compassion. And it especially falls on the shoulders of those who call themselves religious or spiritual, to manifest that sense of care and compassion in our day to day life, so that we can live in a world that is slightly less polarized, slightly less tribal, more understanding of each other, more empathetic, so that for once we can feel what a compassionate, trusting society might look like.
Thank you. That is a beautiful intention to take forward. And I wish you and our entire extended community around the world health and safety and compassion and empathy as we go forward over these next months, and pray also that we can learn from this in a significant way that will make the world a place of greater empathy and compassion. So with that, we'll end our discussion, and I will stop our recording here.
Yep.